Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Thanks,
everyone. Welcome.
thanks for being here tonight. I'm Dr. Michelle Chung. I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Laura Bersenbrug. We're both clinical psychologists and we're co-founders of the Modern Approach to Parenting, or for short, we call it MAP. It's a parenting nonprofit focused on helping families navigate challenging situations using evidence-based strategies and practical support. So we really wanted to create this webinar in response, really, because so many people within the MAP community had reached out and asked us to speak about this topic. And we really wanted to create a space here because of the recent losses in New York City school communities that have really left a lot of parents and teachers, and I know also kids feeling a myriad of complex feelings scared, sad, overwhelmed, unsure of what to do next. So, really, tonight, our goal is not to necessarily have all the answers here, although we will be answering some of them, but our goal is really to help make sense of what we know, talk about how to support our kids and each other, and really leave you with some practical tools that you can use today. So,
And mhm.
mm, no, go on, Laura.
So just wanted to say a few things before we begin. So the first is that we just want to acknowledge that, like Michelle said, a lot of us might be carrying just a lot of different feelings. There's a heaviness right now. So if you're feeling scared, overwhelmed, heartbroken, or if you're wondering what to do, just know that you're here, you're not alone, and we're here with you. This is a really heavy topic. I mean, we're going to be talking about suicide tonight. So if at any point you feel like you need to step away or need to take a break, please feel free to do so. This webinar is being recorded, so you can always come back and just watch the replay. We also designed this space for caregivers as well as parents. So if you do have a child at home right now, we just like to gently suggest that they not watch this live. We will be sending separate content designed specifically to help guide conversations with children and teens. And if you yourself happen to be feeling like you're struggling right now, while you're sitting with us, please feel free to either call or text 988, which is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's a 24/7 lifeline that is 100% confidential. And lastly, many of you have sent in questions, and we had a chance to read all of them, and we will be getting to them later in the presentation during our Q&A.
Okay, so why are we here? And I'll go over a bit of what we'll cover tonight. So, as a community, we are grieving, and there's no really clean way to say that. Some of us here tonight may have known a family, or maybe themselves have experienced some sort of loss. Some of us know a child who knew a child who may have died by suicide, and some of us watching the news, and you're just terrified for your own kid or just what is happening in general. So, all of this is really appropriate. These feelings of fear, anger, hopelessness, helplessness, maybe even guilt, all of it makes sense. And the fact that you're all here tonight tells us that this is something that's really important to you, and showing up and trying to understand is really the most important protective factor that you can do as a caregiver or a parent. So, whatever brought you here with us, thanks for being here. This is just a roadmap for the next hour. We're going to be talking about what we actually know about youth suicide. There's a difference between risk factors and warning signs that we will walk you through, and what actually protects our kids, which is probably more in your hands than you may even realize, and how to have these hard conversations when we know how, or how do we get help? How do we take care of ourselves in the middle of all of this?
And so research has consistently shown that suicide itself is really complex. There's rarely, one cause or one factor. So it's usually not that a child has a single bad grade or there's a single friendship conflict. There's usually a multiple of factors interacting together. And so, because of that, like Michelle said, we will be understanding and focusing on understanding the risks, noticing changes, as well as knowing how and when to get your child support. So, there are a lot of myths around suicide that we wanted to address firstly, because I think sometimes they actually can unintentionally prevent parents from taking action. So one that we hear a lot is, asking about suicide, doesn't that put the idea into their head? So we hear this actually from some of the families that we work with, and what we always tell them is that, it makes sense why this is a worry. And also the research is very, very clear. Asking directly does actually not increase any risk. If anything, it reduces it. Because kids consistently report and even in our offices, we have noticed this with our clients that when they're actually asked, they sometimes feel relieved that someone noticed, that they don't have to carry this scary thing all by themselves, and that someone has actually given them permission to talk. So the second myth we hear a lot is kids who talk about suicide, aren't they just seeking attention? So when a child or a teen brings up suicide, either directly or indirectly, we always take it seriously. It could be that they're just feeling distressed. It could be that they're testing to see if you're a safe person to speak to about this. Um, but we always want to treat every mention as important data into how they're feeling and then respond to it. The third we hear a lot is if they really needed help, they'd ask for it. But the thing is that most kids who are contemplating maybe ending their lives often don't have the capacity to say, help me, I'm struggling and I need help. They often actually communicate this through hints. So they could be things like changes in their behavior. Someone who's usually bubbly all of a sudden becomes withdrawn. They could become more irritable. And our job as caregivers and adults is not to wait for the perfect formal request because it's not probably going to happen, but instead to notice these changes and gently start opening up a conversation. And then lastly, only kids who have a diagnosis are at risk. So sometimes parents might assume, but my child doesn't have anxiety or depression, so I don't need to worry, which is really understandable. However, we know that youth who die by suicide often do not have formal mental health diagnoses on paper. And we want parents actually paying attention to the child that's in front of them. So noticing those changes, noticing those differences in behavior, and those differences from what is usually their baseline.
So one of the most important distinctions that you'll be hearing today during our webinar is really the difference between risk factors and warning signs. A lot of parents, they will ask me, like, what do I need to look out for? And I always say the risk factors are the things that are in the background. There are things that generally don't happen overnight or change overnight, but they do increase the baseline vulnerability over time of the child just managing stress and just different feelings and complicated situations. Usually these risk factors are more slow moving. Um, do they have a prior history of self-harm? That's something we always look for in the clients that we work with. Is there, and not that all self-harm is a predictor, but it is a risk factor. Is there depression, anxiety, ADHD, any experience of trauma? And it could be both types of trauma, right? The big T traumas, which are the more severe incidents that can happen, like a major car accident or an assault, or the small t traumas, which are the small little micro traumas that happen over time, and other diagnosable, other mental health struggles. Is there a family history of suicide? That is also a risk factor. Bullying or isolation is something that we also want to look for in what our children are experiencing, or what they're going through. And then access to lethal means at home. So these are often things like the number one things that we do look for are firearms and guns, because that is one of the most lethal methods of dying by suicide. And so that is something we look for. And then substance use and a history of substance use is also a risk factor. Now, if your child has some of these, and many kids do, that doesn't mean that they're about to, either take their life, or risk taking their life. It just means that we have to keep an eye on them. This is something we want to keep on our radar, and then keep the door open to make what we want to do is be able to be in that kind of watchful waiting stage with our kids, and make sure that the protective changes that we can do as parents and caregivers in their lives that we know can make a difference, make sure that we're doing what we can to help protect them. On the other side of this are the warning signs, and the warning signs are different. They're more acute. This is something where if you start to see some of these changes in these shifts, we do want to do something more immediately. We want to act on them. So what we want to look for is, have these things changed in the last day, the last maybe week, even in the last few hours? And the ones that we act on, even if we're not really sure, are some of these warning signs. So they include things like talking about being a burden. Definitely some teenagers will say things like, I feel like my family is better off without me, that that they just spend so much time or resources taking care of me, worrying about me. This faint and somewhat distant feeling of wanting to disappear, or wishing that they weren't alive. Some kids have actually started to say goodbye in ways that felt a bit final, whether it was to their friends or to their pets or to their family members. Any sort of sudden withdrawal from friends or activities, especially things that that your child really loves doing or finds pleasure in. If all of a sudden there's like a withdrawal from it, or feeling like it's not really exciting anymore, or even if they're pulling away from you, we want to take pause with that. Giving away meaningful things. This is something that is definitely a pattern that we have seen with people who are thinking and contemplating about hurting themselves, or harming themselves. Any sort of big mood shifts, including sudden, um, even if it's erratic behavior, like a sudden sadness or an anger, but even a sudden calm after a long period of distress is a risk factor. This is something that oftentimes um, teenagers will feel, because they feel like finally there's an end to some of their pain and suffering. Any sort of increased risk-taking behavior, such as drinking, reckless driving, just seeming more careless and not caring about what happens to them, is a risk factor. Oftentimes you'll see certain searches online or on social media about ways that they can harm themselves, or ways to end things. Uh, a lot of times they will see certain search history of topics like that. So those are sort of the bigger risk factors that we know about, but there are also risk factors and signs that a lot of parents and caregivers, that adults have a tendency to miss. These are more subtle, and especially in maybe high achieving families, or families that have been grown up and in a culture, a family culture that have told them that strong people don't talk about feelings, that this is not something that we do. These are the subtle signs you really want to look for, right? There's the kid that keeps asking, I'm fine. Their grades seem fine. They're still smiling. They're showing up to things, but maybe sometimes you're noticing their appetite is a little different or their sleep is off. Maybe they're sleeping a little bit too much or really late, sleeping too little, or something like the spark or the joy in them that they used to have is all of a sudden dim, right? The sudden calm after weeks of distress. Sometimes, again, you'll see some of that coming out. They are really stressed out. They're running on a certain frequency, a high frequency, and all of a sudden, oh, there's like a little bit of relief. Sometimes that could mean, okay, they're just weathering the storm and they're feeling better. But it also is an indicator of like, okay, something has shifted. And so we just want to make sure that we're watching any of those shifts, right? Hidden grief. Hidden grief is something that we don't talk about enough. These might be the smaller things that, frankly, you might not notice in your child's life. So they could be things like maybe a breakup. It could be romantic. It could be within a friend group, or even a public figure, a loss of a public figure. Somebody that maybe it was an idol, somebody that they really admired, that was a celebrity, but they don't really talk about it. You don't really know about it. So there's these hidden losses or hidden grief. And then even sometimes you might see it in these subtle, what I call throwaway lines. Oh, you'd be better off without me, or I just don't want to be here. I don't care anymore. Sometimes even they'll say these with like a half laugh, but you do want to notice, right? You don't want to just let them pass and not say anything. You do want to pause and just kind of, you know, take note of, and maybe you do want to follow up and ask some questions. The other thing that you'll subtly may notice are friend group shifts. So a kid that might be having tons of plans and social interactions, they're suddenly more lonely, they're suddenly more alone, they're withdrawing. Maybe some friends might have dropped out of some friendship groups, unusually isolated. Even online you might see some of these shifts. And another thing that we have heard of a lot is late night digital activity. So sometimes you'll see these kids up till 2 a.m. There's a sort of natural craving for other connections or interactions with other people, that's almost like feels a little bit more desperate. Maybe with accounts that you don't recognize and connections with these new people. And then again, certain content searches that online you might not, that just seem a little bit off, certain things that are shifting. And I think a lot of these, especially the more subtle cues, parents often feel like, oh my goodness, I have to look at all their search history. I have to kind of be on top of all these things. I always tell parents, you don't need to be necessarily a detective. You don't need to be digging through everything that your child is going through and interacting with, but you do want to stay curious. You want to be willing to ask certain questions, but you don't want to be intrusive, right? So what you really want to do is just being present and just noticing some of these shifts and changes. If you see enough of these shifts and changes, you do want to ask and be curious. And later we'll go through some more exact ways that you can do that.
The research consistently shows that protective factors can support children and teens and reduce overall risk. And I think one of the good news here is that a lot of them just already are happening in everyday moments. So things like through routines, conversations with friends, daily habits. So as we're thinking about protective factors, I'd like you to think about what you and your child may already be doing. And for this week, maybe trying to be more intentional in how you engage in those habits. So the first big one is that, of course, connection really matters, because kids who feel that they have someone they can turn to are more likely to reach out when it's a true crisis. So even just one trusted adult who consistently is showing up for them can help to move the needle when there's a difficult moment. So this could be yourself, it could be a coach, a therapist, school counselor at school. Um, but the big thing is that being present itself can be worked into your day to day. So that could be something like maybe spending the last 10 minutes before bedtime when phones are away, screens are away, just kind of checking in with them and just seeing how their day was. Belonging refers to that feeling that there are people who know me and I matter in this space. And feeling wanted somewhere. It could be at school, at home, in a peer group, in a sports team, or even a cultural community, we know is very protective for helping to instill that sense of belonging. Mean safety actually is something that we sometimes hear in clinical language. And what that refers to is reducing access to items that someone could use to seriously harm themselves during a period of crisis. So this really matters because in those intense moments of distress, they sometimes can be almost temporary, and actually creating more time and space can help to create those opportunities for intervention in that moment as well as support. And we'll be talking in the next slide just about different ways that you can kind of safety proof different means for dying by suicide. So access to care matters because getting support earlier for children and teens who we might notice are not behaving like their usual selves or something that feels like it's a change. And actually equipping them with some type of support ahead of time can be incredibly helpful just for already being preventative. And we usually encourage families to just not wait until it's that crisis point and things are feeling really urgent to start building a support team. So knowing who those people are, such as your child's pediatrician, a therapist, either outside or even a school counselor, like inside the school, and other resources that can be part of that team. So if in case, there is a true crisis, we're not scrambling for who do I call, what do I do? And we'll be talking just about planning and what that process looks like a little bit later. Having open communication definitely matters. So kids who know that hard topics are allowed at the table, there's something that we don't avoid. There's something that our family feels comfortable, having a conversation about, just helps to model reaching out and taking those opportunities. So open communication, I think, really matters here because in those moments of difficulty, kids will be more likely to share if we're already having that safe space that's been created. And so, lastly, a protective factor that I really love is just hope and meaning. So, not just feeling connected to values, but also to identity, future goals, their family, to that community. They really matter because having hope and meaning helps to bring yourself out of just the present and looking backwards towards the past, and actually connect you to the future and looking forward and helps to really instill that sense of purpose, longer term. So 1 year from now, 5 years from now, what would I want to be doing? What are my dreams? What are my goals? And those can sometimes be really shining examples when someone is really going through a crisis. So, speaking of making means safer and really trying to create those safeguards, one of the biggest practical steps that we hope you take away from this webinar tonight is that there are ways to make the home environment more safe. And so we just know that, in these intense periods of distress, things can escalate very quickly. Distress can quickly go from what we call the green zone at maybe like a 0 to a 4 to an 8 to 10 very quickly. So actually safeguarding any means for causing harm can really create that space, that time to have a conversation with your child, to follow a protocol, in order to get them the support that they need and to assess risk and safety. So, what that might look in practice is if you do have a firearm in your home, please consider storing it offsite. So, if it does need to remain in the home, we highly recommend keeping it locked, unloaded, keeping ammunition stored separately from the firearm. And we'll provide some different resources just of ways that you can actually safeguard firearms in the worksheets and the parent take homes that we have that we'll be providing at the end of the webinar. Medications are something to also consider safeguarding. So definitely anything that's kept in a bottle, that's stored in larger quantities. So could be prescriptions, could be things like over the counter, like Tylenol, Benadryl. Lock boxes on something like Amazon cost maybe $20 and can help to reduce access. I have some clients that as part of their own safety plan, parents store their medication and they actually give them, daily, like, the 1 or 2 pills that they need daily, and parents hold on to the medication. And I think, during these periods, like we've been highlighting, there can be those warning signs. And I think during those times, other means such as knives, sharps, razors, even ropes, or belts, can be, taken and can be safeguarded. So putting it in a place where, you've not communicated it to your child, in a place that only you know. And I think the goal here is that, we're not trying to make our home 100%, foolproof. We cannot probably eliminate every single possible risk, but our goal is to really try to tackle, the ones that we know that really are those lethal methods, and to create more of that time and that space and that opportunity for support.
Yeah, I think and I feel like as parents, so many of us here or caregivers, as we're sort of going through this, it's it increases your level of stress and anxiety. I will say, just kind of speaking to before we move on to kind of taking care of yourself, it is it I have been very surprised, especially, we're New York City therapists. I thought a lot of people wouldn't have firearms in their home. But you would be very surprised of how many teenagers, um, where there are firearms in the home, do know where they are. And every single one of those parents have told me, they're like, they don't know that we even own a firearm, or they don't know how to get to the firearms, but they almost every single case the teenagers had known, and they knew how to get to them. So it's surprising. It's surprising. That's the best way to put it. I think as parents, one of the hardest things to do is to hear some of this and not feel like you have to immediately move into action mode. Whether it's, you know, again, making some of the lethal means in your house, farther and harder to get to, or if you're discussing with your child and they say, "Hey, I'm struggling in this way." I think immediately as parents, we want to get into that place where we're trying to problem solve. We're going right into action mode. and you want to protect your child, right? You want to say the right thing, you want to make sense of what happened and make sure everyone's okay. But what all the research is showing, and what we know from our own practical experience in the work that we do, is that before we are able to support our children, that we really have to acknowledge that as caregivers, as parents, we are, there's a way in which we co-regulate each other, right? If we show up to the conversation or to the room in a very anxious and very highly wired state, our children are also catching that, right? That feeling is a very catchy feeling. Whereas if we show up in a more calm and regulated place, then they are also regulating and co regulating with us. And so it's really important as parents, to really look at ourselves first and to wonder and learn, how do I regulate myself? What works for me to be able to stay in a very regulated, calm place? We often use the airplane analogy, right? Put your oxygen mask on first before you are able to do for your own. And it is because our children require emotional energy and steadfastness in order for us to show up for them in a way that is hard. And I do think, there's all of these studies and books, right? The anxious generation, we're showing that levels of anxiety, the speed at which the world is moving, everything is just increasing. And a lot of times our brains and our nervous systems are not built to move at that pace and to go at that rate. And so what we need to do is to really help our children and ourselves be able to calm that nervous system down, to not be so overwhelmed, and to know that, okay, there's, even before you're able to say something, what's the right thing to say, what's the right thing to do, it would be very immediately to be able to take that step back and to take a few deep breaths and to regulate ourselves, right? um and not, instead of going to that panicked and frenzy place of, oh my gosh, what's the right thing to do, what do I say right now, what you really want to do is um ask yourself the first question of, like, what am I feeling right now? Because we do, there's the saying, name it to tame it. And there is something very neurobiological about that. Feelings are they're feelings, right? They're not logical. When you name it, you're actually moving that feeling from your feeling part of your brain more towards the frontal lobes, or the language and the thinking part of your brain. And so you're actually moving that situation from an emotional response more towards a, hey, let's think about this, let's make sense of this. So really ask yourself first, what am I feeling right now, and what do I need right now so that I can be present for my child? Because one of the most powerful things that we can offer our children is really not that perfect response. It's a regulated and grounded presence for them in that moment when they're not, right? And so um, let's talk about some caregiver coping tools. We want to give you, as caregivers, some practical tools that you can use, because frankly, supporting your child through some of these more difficult emotions can be, and situations can be exhausting, right? So these may sound pretty simple, but during a period of stress, especially if it's prolonged period of stress or even grief, they're often the first things that disappear, right? Physical self-care. Stick to the basics. Are you sleeping in a regular way or enough? Are you eating regular meals? Are you getting some sunlight? Are you hydrating? Are you exercising, or at least going for some walks? Because stress affects our body, right? As much as it affects our minds and our mental states. When our own needs are really depleted, it becomes much harder to support other people, right? You can't pour from an empty cup, I like to say. The second thing is to reach out to your community for support. We know that when a person stresses out, there's a lot of times, and the reaction is to pull away, right? It feels overwhelming. I don't want to have to deal with other people's reactions or maybe feelings that I might have being around other people. It could be shame, guilt, all these other things. But the what the research has shown is that actually leaning on trusted friends, family members, maybe it could be a faith community, even support groups. These are things that are protective factors to be able to not feel isolated and alone and to feel like, oh, there's a way that there are people here that are going to go through this with me. And so really being able to avoid isolation, right? Sometimes even between couples, there's a way in which couples also want to isolate from each other rather than coming together and leaning on each other and supporting each other. A lot of times in these moments, partners, couples, there's that tendency to want to isolate, right? Hold everything privately, and then on the outside, just put up this strong front, right? Um, it's important to remember strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone, and that means you're a strong person. Sometimes strength means being able to share some of that burden and that responsibility with one another. And just to remember that shame, which is sometimes one of the most toxic feelings, it makes you want to hide, right? It makes you want to go into isolation, to not see another person, to not appear vulnerable. Um, in those moments, it is so important to act opposite to that feeling, to be able to get out there and say, okay, I may feel this shame, but I am going to do what I can to create these connections and to feel less alone. And finally, really being able to look for that professional help, right? If you notice that you're struggling to function, feeling stuck in intense distress, maybe feeling frozen, or sometimes if you every time you go to caregive, caregiver burnout is a real thing, right? Every time you start to feel lots of resentment, and then that resentment is followed by guilt or shame, that is a real indicator that you might want to look out and reach for some more support, because these emotions and just caregiving in general is it's difficult, right? And so looking for that professional support, especially when needed, is really important. Um, I think it's so easy as caregivers and parents to be able to look at our children and want to create the support system around them, all of these things we were talking about before. But as parents and caregivers, we too really deserve that support system and that intentional care as well. Okay. So here's here's some real practical scripts that I think could be helpful for a lot of parents out there. So really, how do we ask these questions, right? How, if you've noticing somebody's been a bit off, whether it's your child or maybe somebody else in your life, maybe it made you think twice or pause, or you've been wondering, should I bring it up? How do I bring it up? You know, we hear from parents all the time that there's that worry of saying something and then that might make it worse. But the thing that you want to remember about the thing that you want to remember is that most people, if they're already feeling it, if they're already thinking about it, it's already on the forefront of their mind, right? Um, it makes sense to worry about it, but again, the most important thing is to be direct, to be calm, and to show them that they're not alone and that you care. So you don't want to quiz them. You want it to be, I always say it's more like an open doorway so that You want to open that doorway so that they can make the choice to walk in, right? So here's a question you can borrow tonight. I've noticed you haven't seemed like yourself lately. Have you been having thoughts about hurting yourself or ending your life, or maybe feeling like there's no hope? Whenever it is that a person feels like there's no hope, that's a real risk factor, right? An indicator. We want to use direct language. Research shows us that asking directly does not increase that risk. And for many kids, being asked directly helps them feel a sense of relief because they feel noticed. They feel like somebody is seeing that they're carrying something difficult, right? You can also a few things that could help is to start the conversation in instead of assumptions. You want to say, I've noticed you've seemed quieter lately, or you haven't seemed like yourself. What you're really communicating here is that I'm noticing, I care, I see you. And sometimes these conversations also feel easier side by side rather than face to face. So this is where I think, especially for teenagers in the car, this or during a walk, these are the best times to be able to talk to each other, because sometimes looking at each other just feels too intense, right? So it's to be able to create these safer spaces so our children can open up and to talk. And don't, if you don't answer right away, if the kids don't answer right away, that's okay too, right? You don't want to rush to fill the silence. It's just a pause, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Don't fill in the pause for them. Sometimes it means that you're just trying to find the words. They're trying to find the words to something difficult. And a few things to avoid is try not to minimize and use statements like, what, you have nothing to be sad about, or everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. You want to avoid immediately jumping into lectures, or again, just try to problem solve it. Oh, let's do this instead, or maybe we can do this differently. Give it some space to be able to sit in that feeling. And don't promise to keep safety concerns a secret. Because a lot of times, if you go down that route and you realize, ooh, there's something more, you want to be able to, be able to keep their trust.
And now that you've prompted the question, a lot of times kids actually will open up, and we actually use this framework in a lot of our clinical work. So, it's from a type of therapy that is very near and dear to our hearts called dialectical behavior therapy. And the first step is really just to take that deep breath and listen to everything that your child says all the way through. And I know sometimes this can feel a little excruciating because we really have to fight that urge to just step in and problem solve, but really try to stick with them, listen, and you can always ask open-ended or Socratic questions, leading with curiosity to help them open up more. So even things like, I'm curious about that, help me understand it. Can you say more about what that's been like for you? Or even a simple tell me more can just prompt them to open up further and signals that you're a safe person to speak about this. The second step would be to validate. We always want to try to validate before we jump into that problem solving. Because I think for something that's just, as intense or vulnerable as a conversation about how they're feeling really deserves that space to show that they're feeling they're understood by you, that this is a safe space. So even starting with something very simple, like that sounds incredibly hard. I'm really glad that you told me, or I can understand why you felt so overwhelmed in that moment. I'm here for you. So we're not agreeing with everything that they're saying, but we are communicating that their pain is real and it makes sense. We do have a free worksheet on the Modern Approach to Parenting website that has validating statements and a lot of different examples of different things that you could try saying. The third is to stay present as well as stay calm. So kids in general take emotional cues from caregivers, but particularly in this moment. So as we've mentioned, use your own calm down skills in this moment take that breath and also show that you're present. You're not avoiding this conversation. You're helping them to really stay in it. You can say things like, I'm right here for you. We're going to figure this out together, or you don't have to carry this by yourself. And lastly, we want to actually make a plan with them. So, not a plan for them, but with them, because their input is very important here. It helps to increase their buy-in. And also, they really are the expert on how they're feeling. So, we really, really value their opinion and their thoughts on what will work versus won't work. And I think the key here is we're really trying to figure out, is my child safe? What is the level of danger and assessing that? And also helping to equip them with different tools, emotion regulation skills that they can use in that moment. So they move from, I have no option, but to harm myself, to actually, there are some things that I can do to help myself. So that could be even things like doing jumping jacks to release adrenaline, self-soothing. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about different emotion regulation skills. We also have a lot of those resources available online at the MAP website. And I think this is always a very key moment that if your child is connected with treatment, contact their therapist or psychiatrist who can actually help with assessing level of risk. And if there's an immediate concern for safety, like your child is really indicated, okay, they have a plan, they have intent, and this cannot wait. We always highly recommend just calling 911 or taking them to an ER, because that's going to be the safest place for them at that moment.
So I want to spend a few minutes here just talking about identity, family, and stories we inherit, because I think a lot of us here are um, are from potentially from families where mental health might have historically not been a part of the conversation, or maybe even feelings or vulnerability. Um, this is an opportunity really for all of us to break some of those intergenerational cycles, to be able to model using language and emotional language and vulnerability in a way that we might not have ever seen within our families. But being able to show our kids and families that there is a different way and that it's not so weird, and we can start to talk about emotions and mental health or whatever it might be. This is really a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to kind of bridge some of those gaps, right, that we might have experienced in our own upbringing. And so our kids are brought up in a way that is it's so lovely because they are given the emotional language at a much earlier age now, especially with all the social emotional learning curriculums within the schools and things like that, and social media. They are presented with the language. They learn the language a lot earlier, in a way that maybe we haven't. And so I think just challenging all of us as parents to be able to just try that, right? Try that with our kids and try and break some of those cycles and bridge those gaps.
Great. And so, we wanted to give you some practical skills here. So, parents often ask us, how do I know when I should worry? And what am I actually supposed to do here? So, we often use this framework in our own sessions to actually assess risk for our clients. So, there are different levels that we think about in terms of, level of safety and level of risk. So, this first green level is called noticing. So, we're noticing that something feels different. Maybe their sleep is off, they're a little more withdrawn, friendships have shifted. If you're at the noticing level, I would encourage you to have a conversation this week and lead with curiosity. So it doesn't need to be, a capital S sit down. It could be built into your usual routine, maybe while you're cooking or you're going for that walk. But asking questions just to get a sense of how they're doing, like how has your week really been going? Has anything been feeling hard lately? And then even just inquiring on like how things are with your friends, school, stress, and using those validating statements and coming up with the plan, like we had talked about before. Um, the second step is worried. So this is the second stage that we sometimes notice for the clients that we work with. So this would be the warning signs level. So we're noticing visible warning signs. Like, for example, maybe your child has made a statement like, I don't want to be here, everyone would be better off without me. So if your child is at this level, I would say within the next few days, have that conversation of asking them the direct question and try not to avoid it. We want to have you think about increasing the safety at home. So this could be, safe-proofing the house, just like we've talked about. I think at this level, we also want to consider whether you bring in additional support. So if they're already connected to a treatment team, this is a time to let their therapist know, like, hey, they let me know this. I wanted to let you know that ASAP. Or, I think if they haven't received care, this is a time to also maybe start thinking about how do we resource ourselves and how do we get in contact with, a treatment provider. And the last, sometimes scary category is, things are really urgent. So we would consider this level when there's a plan, there's intent, or there has been a recent suicide attempt. So at this point, safety really is the name of the game and it's the priority. So stay with them and seek immediate support. So this could be, calling 911, bringing them yourself to the pediatric emergency room, calling for mobile crisis services to come in and do an evaluation to see if they, like actually need to go to the ER. I think the big thing here is that, as parents, you don't need to become a clinician. But we do need to make sure that we're prioritizing safety in that moment and, resourcing ourselves to help us make these judgment calls. And I actually wanted to share a safety plan that I work on with my clients in session. So if we can go to the next slide, this is one that I work on with actually a lot of clients who um, might have something like self-harm, or they might like already be predisposed to, having higher levels of distress. So we'll share this later, but this is what something of a safety plan can look like. I think step one and step two are particularly useful. So helping them to even think through what are their own warning signs. And then step two is coming up with a tailored skill set. And I think, as parents, this could be like, okay, when you're feeling distressed, what helps you to feel calmer? And what we would do, in session is oftentimes trying to match the skill to the intensity level, because there are actually a variety of different skills that work at different intensity levels better, that don't work as well at maybe like a lower intensity level. So we'll share this. And again, I think, if you're on the fence of like, does my child need maybe clinical support, this is also something that a clinician is really trained to do and can be helpful for creating, a safety plan that's then implemented at home.
And I just want to say one more thing, which is really important for I think a lot of us as caregivers and parents is that as parents, I think we try our best to protect our children and to prevent bad things from happening. Um, but especially when it comes to something like suicide, there is nothing as a parent that you can do to cause a child to attempt or to uh complete a suicide. And I think that is extremely important to just put out there and to know, because there is again, I think it's just innately in us as parents to want to do whatever we can to protect our kids from something like this. um but I think uh it's also important to remember, like, that there's no way that you can cause it.
I know that's a really, really good point, Michelle. And I think that's one of the big takeaways here for sure. So we just wanted to give you some resources that you can turn to at any time. These are fantastic. Just so you're aware, there are pediatric ERs in the city. NYU Langone has one. Mount Sinai, I think Kravis has one, as well as Cohen Children's. So it's just helpful to know these ahead of time, just so then that way you're not kind of scrambling if it is a true moment of crisis. So we wanted to open it up to a few of to some of our questions, and we'll be mindful of time. So if you do have a few minutes to stay with us, please feel free to. If you do need to head on out, we are recording this webinar, and you'll get a copy. So you'll get some of the answers to the questions there.
So definitely we can start off with some pre-submitted questions, Laura.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so I think the first one is how do I bring this up to my child without scaring them?
yeah, I think for this one, it's it's interesting because I think we are all afraid of scaring our children. I mean, frankly, even I, uh, y- when we heard about each of the deaths by suicide this year, I definitely came home and brought it up with my son, um, in a way of just kind of starting off with curiosity, right? And asking, hey, what did you hear about, what did you hear about this? And I kind of just started very broadly and would bring it into a little bit more and more detail. And then just bringing the questions up of, hey, who, who are the people that you would talk to, right? If you can't talk to me, who's your other trusted adult that's outside the family? Really being able to come up with, again, some of those protective factors. I think if you're noticing that your kid is acting a little differently, I think it's important to open that up with curiosity too, right? And just saying, hey, I noticed that you seem a little different lately, and I want to check in. And just know that sometimes it can be a direct answer, and sometimes it might take a little bit more time for them to open up. But you're at least saying, like, hey, I'm here, and this conversation is not too big or too scary for me. Like, I'm willing to have it, right? Um, okay. What about, I feel like this is another good question. My child says they're fine. Do I push?
This is a great one. So I would say in that moment, you don't necessarily need to push, but also don't assume that that's it, the conversation is over. I think sometimes it's helpful to actually explain a little of like why you even asked how they're doing. So you could say something like, I just wanted to check in because I've been thinking about you. I'm here if you want to talk later. I think we do see that sometimes it takes repeated conversations to actually get to a deeper level, especially if your child might not be comfortable opening up in that way. So sometimes, you can actually just think of things like, how can I create more opportunities for the type of connection that would facilitate those conversations? So when we're going for a walk, is a great time. If you're in a long car ride with them, that's a great time too. So really, those everyday moments, I think, are the times that we can kind of take advantage of. It doesn't need to be like, again, like this capital S sit down, because that can sometimes actually put too much pressure. So yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, I think the other piece too is that um, I would say when parents actually model talking about feelings, like that's also something that you can start doing. So it isn't necessarily just like dumping on your child, like these are all the things that are going on in my life, but it could just be like, oh, this happened and I'm feeling frustrated. Because that already just signals to them that this is a safer space, for us to have conversations about feelings.
There's a question here about I'm worried about I'm worried about my partner thinks I'm overreacting. What now?
Mm,
This is a really common one we get a lot from parents where
mhm,
one maybe parent is more worried than the other. Um, what I will say is we generally tell parents to shift the conversation from like these are the reasons why and convincing the other parent because sometimes that makes them want to dig their heels in deeper into their position. But instead of just kind of saying, you know, this is the facts, right? Because you can't argue with facts, right? Our kid used to love doing this and now they're not doing it as much. Or did you notice these statistics of all these kids recently that are feeling more anxious and depressed, and I'm noticing this in our kid. And then just being able to take a reasonable, just small first step that you and your partner can do together. Um, I think sometimes partners reject that worrying and that anxiety because it feels overwhelming or they don't want to face it. There's almost like a denial. But if you give them a little something, like a small action step that they can hold on to, and just again, facts, then usually they'll at least start to take some steps towards, both of you will start taking steps towards the right, or not the right, but the same direction.
great. And there's another question here. How do I talk to my younger child about what happens at school? So I think I actually have had this come up fairly recently, and it's tough. And I would recommend to really just try to keep it brief, honest, and the big thing here is age appropriate. So saying something like, something really sad happened at school. There are a lot of adults working hard to, help all the students and support people right now. So we also, I would say don't want to share any like detailed information or share specific methods. I think the question comes up of like, do I share with my younger child? A lot of times it's already been like maybe even addressed or talked about in class. So um, I think actually kind of having that conversation just signals that you're a safe person to speak to about this. So I think it's not a matter of if it's like prompting that in their mind, but actually modeling like this is how we talk about something that's really sad. This is what adults are doing to try to help and support people in our community. And I think one thing for children is that they process sometimes slower than like a teenager does. So there might be follow-up questions that they have that might pop out of nowhere, seemingly nowhere, but they're actually thinking about it. So you might get a question later that day, at bedtime or even days later. So if you do, that's very normal. It's not necessarily that they're dwelling on it, but it just takes them like a little bit longer to process the information.
There was another question here, which I thought was a great one about building resilience and self-worth in
Mm,
our children during tough moments or disappointments. And I think this is a really big one. I think that this is where this meaning and feeling valued, that their presence, or that their if their absence would really be felt and would actually make an impact on the community or group in general. This is where I think building a sense of kind of going back to those family stories, that they're a part of a longer chain, a longer history, a longer lineage, and that there is a future, and that it's interesting when initially all of these deaths by suicide were happening in New York City. A bunch of parents and I were talking about this, and we were really discussing the systemic changes that really need to happen in order to support some real, um, make a real difference in what's happening. And one of the main things that we were talking about is how a lot of times our kids um, are not able to fail in the same way that they were before. I always say that self-confidence is built on evidence, right? It's not built on just somebody telling you you're so great or you can do this. Self-confidence and self-worth is really built on feeling valued and the evidence you know, um, of failing in some way or making a mistake, whatever it is, and then knowing that they can bounce back and experiencing that, right? And I think that sometimes there's a way in which this modern day parenting can be so protective that we don't allow our children to build that type of self-worth, and that type of self-confidence. And I do think that that is something to think about, as we are discussing what are some ways of building that self-worth and self-confidence in our children. Um, and so, I mean, it seems like a backwards answer there, but I will say I think it's to allow them to trip up, to make mistakes, to not be perfect, and then to be there to support them in building themselves back up.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think a couple of other questions. First of all, Angela, thank you for sharing your experience. And absolutely, we will give you access to these slides. We have some additional worksheets that we'll be providing just on the topic. So we'll also be providing that to you in a follow-up email. And then there's a question here. Is it really appropriate to ask directly? What things should I hide or put out of access from my child? Great question. So, I think here asking directly, we would consider it appropriate, and I think the thing is that depending on what age your child is, we could, I think when we were making this presentation, the question that we had written down of how to ask that question was kind of designed for almost like a preteen teenager, partially because we, clinically and I think in research sometimes see those ages as, being times where there, are might be people that there are, children or teens who are maybe thinking about, ending their lives by suicide. So I think it's like a piece here is that, there's no one right way, and you know your child the best, meaning that take it as a template and almost like personalize it to them. So I think that can go into the delivery. If it really maybe needs to be more of a sit down, because that's how what your child responds to. If it's something that can be slipped in more casually, and your child might open up a little bit more. I think in terms of what needs to be put away, we definitely look back at the mean safety slide, but the ones that we really think about are firearms, medication, as well as sharps, so knives, razors. And I think the big thing here is that we cannot, 100% um, make our homes like 100% safety proof. But the big thing is that in a true moment of crisis, we are trying to buy time as well as space to get in there and to hopefully, help our kids out in that moment, or to, talk to them in that moment. So that's really what we're going for. But I think the big ones really are those three that we listed. Great.
Here's another one
Mhm.
that came in. What if we know of a person who's attempted? How do we as a community try to prevent
Mm,
this again? Um, yeah, I mean that one's a really tricky one. You know, I think that as a community, what one of the main things that I think we need to do is to try and break down that negative stigma of asking
mhm.
for help and support, right? So if you are connected to this person in some way, or even this family in some way, to be able to share with them ways that maybe you had asked for support, or other people that you know of that have, just to make it a little bit more common for them. Um, I think it's one of those things that the more people talk about it, asking for support and getting help, the easier it will be for that person to embrace that idea. Um, and I mean, I'm so thankful to these younger generations who are growing up in a world where it doesn't, it's not maybe as stigmatized. I mean, it still does carry a stigma, but maybe it's just not as stigmatized. Um, and I think being able to try and just like, sometimes if I go to a coffee shop and I see a bunch of young 20 somethings sitting together, and then they'll be like, my therapist told me, it's just, I love it. It's just a part of the conversation, and what they do, like going, to the doctor to get their physical or a mammogram or whatever it might be. Um, and so I do think that trying to help and break down that stigma as much as possible is probably going to be one of the biggest things.
Absolutely. And I think, a big piece of this too, is sometimes all the emotions that are carried with it, right? So things like shame, things like guilt. And I think really by reaching out and offering support, like what we're doing is actually signaling this is not shameful, like there's nothing to feel ashamed of. I'm here for you. And I think that in and of itself for a family that, might be going through something like an attempt, really just shows like, okay, we're not alone. And I think that in and of itself really helps to change the culture, within the community. And like Michelle said, I think Gen Z, Alpha Gen are having some of these conversations more than millennials and older like grew up doing. So I think sometimes we actually hear from teens that we work with that they're actually talking about things like, how they're feeling, the urge to self-harm, suicidal ideation. And parents are sometimes shocked because, kids might not be actually disclosing that to the parents. So I think, a takeaway here is that it's wonderful that a lot of I do think that Gen Z and Alpha Gen are kind of at the forefront of really destigmatizing mental health, that they might already be having those conversations. And so, the biggest change of asking direct, like, as parents asking them directly, is that this new source is now asking. But what that also does is signal that, hey, I'm here for you. I get it. You can come talk to me. Yeah. So, there are a few other questions that we've received, and I think, Michelle, what we can do is we can answer them and send them to you via email. Um, but I think our big takeaways here are, you're not alone. Like, I think really even just seeing like how many people have shown up today is just such a good reminder of that. We are connected to each other. Like, as we're thinking about this, like, I think relying on each other, for community, for support is incredibly important. I think definitely as two psychologists, like we see this come up and we want to offer our support as well. So if you have any questions, even if it's, a couple of weeks, like you're thinking about it and something occurs to you, please send us an email. Um, Definitely, like we're constantly checking our emails. We love answering questions, so we're here, and we can answer them then.
Absolutely. And if you want to stay, just to so we'll email you a parent takeaway sheet with a lot of the information from the slides that are condensed there, um, and a New York City resource directory and a recording of tonight's webinar should come out within about like 24 to 48 hours. If you want to stay connected with the MAP community, we are on Instagram at Modern Approach to Parenting, and we publish weekly notes on our Substack. They're kind of like these newsletters about a parenting topic, every about week or every 2 weeks, and you can sign up for that on our website. And we host free community events, and sort of office hours about every month, workbooks, journals, guides, and hopefully, we will be sort of coming out with a book soon too. So keep a lookout for that. And if you're in crisis right now, we have all of the information out there for you. I know this webinar took a little bit longer than everyone had anticipated. I know everyone's super busy, so thanks for being here tonight. Take care of yourselves, be gentle with each other, be gentle with yourself, and we wish you a good night.
Thank you so much for being with us. Take care.
Take care.